What happened was there was a high school in Juneau, Alaska that was on the route of the Olympic torch in 2002. There was a student at the school named Joe Frederick, and he was sort of an iconoclastic fellow, and he and his friends decided that it would be fun to do something when the torch ran by that would be sort of exciting and different and a little bit controversial, and see if they could get on TV that night. So they made a banner, a big banner. It's like 20 feet long, 5 or 6 feet tall. And they put this slogan on it that said, "Bong hits for Jesus." The principal didn't like the banner at all. She actually came across the street and told them to put it down, and when they didn't put it down fast enough, she actually tore it out of their hands and wadded it up and told Joe Frederick, "You're reporting to the principal's office." So he got to the principal's office. She said, "This was unacceptable behavior. You're being suspended for 5 days." At which point he said, "Well, Thomas Jefferson said we founded this country to have freedom of speech. Would you kick Thomas Jefferson out for 5 days?" At which point the principal said, "You're suspended for 10 days for talking back." One of the big cases that you mentioned was Tinker versus Des Moines School District in 1969. In that one, there were students who were protesting against the Vietnam War. So they wore black armbands to protest the war. And the U.S. Supreme Court said, look, these armbands aren't causing any real problem. The students might be talking about things in the hallway that are not your choice of what they would be talking about, but it's not really disrupting the class day. And in Morse v. Frederick, what the majority of the Supreme Court said is, if a student is advocating in favor of using illegal drugs, the school can punish them, period. Well, that's a great question. And it was one of the things that was a point of difference in some of the opinions that different justices wrote. Justice Stevens, for example, he wrote a dissent where he basically said, can't you people tell this was a joke? The majority, however, said, well, we aren't sure exactly what bong hits for Jesus means, but one of the things it might mean is I encourage you to break the marijuana laws and smoke marijuana, because that's one of the things it might mean it was okay for the school to punish Mr. Frederick for saying it. Yes, in most situations, you have a constitutional right to encourage people to do things. And this includes actually encouraging people to break the law. I mean, if you think back to the civil rights movement, when we had segregated lunch counters in some parts of this country, there would be civil rights activists who were saying, all right, folks, this is a bad law, it needs to change. The way we're going to change it is we're going to have so many of us break this law until the prisons can't hold all of us anymore. And so that type of speech where you're actually encouraging, not only are you encouraging people to take political action, but you're even encouraging them to do something that might be illegal, in most circumstances you're allowed to do that very explicitly. If you're actually inciting people to violence in a way that is very direct, and so that within the next 5 minutes an assault is likely to happen. If I encourage you to pick up a brick and throw it at someone sitting right over there, and I'm really egging you on, that type of incitement could be punished by the police and the prosecutors. But in general, we have a great deal of freedom in this country to encourage people to do things, even if they're illegal. In 1940, there was an important case about Jehovah's Witness families who did not want their children to be saying the Pledge of Allegiance at school. According to their religion, you only pledge allegiance to God, and anything that's on the earthly plane is not something you take that sort of oath for. Well, the students were actually suspended from school because they wouldn't say the Pledge of Allegiance, and this went up to the U.S. Supreme Court, and they upheld the punishment, in 1943, there ended up being another case on a similar topic, and the U.S. Supreme Court reversed itself. And they said, no, everyone in our country has a right to freedom of conscience to decide what they believe, and the government can't force you to stand up and say you believe something if you don't. And in this opinion, they took a very different view. They said the purpose of a school is, yes, it's to train people to be citizens, but what is a citizen? A citizen is someone who thinks critically, thinks individually, doesn't go along with the crowd, asks tough questions. And they talked about, diversity of opinion. They talked about intellectual freedom, and they said that's what a school is for. I mean, I think it's great for teachers to engage students on controversial topics. And one thing that was sort of interesting about Morse v. Frederick decision is some of the justices who agreed with the outcome, they were a little worried that it might be going too far. And so it was Justice Alito and Justice Kennedy wrote this separate opinion that says, okay, we agree that bong hits for Jesus banners can be punished, but we want to remind everyone that students can and should have open intellectual debates about the wisdom of our country's laws, but you need to do it in a way that doesn't look like you're advocating breaking the laws. In the mid-'80s, there was another case that went to the U.S. Supreme Court, and it was actually out of the state of Washington. It was called Bethel School District versus Fraser. Mm-hmm. And what happened in that one is the student was giving a nominating speech for senior class officers, and he was punished for for misusing the school assembly. The opinion that was written in 1986 was sort of hard to determine which of two theories they were operating on. One theory would be, well, hey, this student did something disruptive. There was other language in the opinion that just sort of said, no, we aren't really concerned about whether there was disruption. We just think that this was misbehavior and the school should be able to punish misbehavior. This is not the way we behave when we're given the microphone and talking to a captive audience. What's difficult in a lot of cases is identifying what is harassment that we want to remove from the school and what is speech that we just don't happen to like. The courts have said that in terms of symbols that could have racially derogatory overtones like a swastika or a Confederate flag, that it sort of depends on what the history has been at that school. If it is a school where there's been lots of racial tension and bringing these symbols in is likely to result in there being fights or disruptions or increasing racial tension, then a school could say, we're not going to allow that symbol in. And always, if a student is coming in wearing a swastika or waving a noose around, you can always have a talk with that student and say, do you understand how this feels to members of minority groups and so on? There are lots of things that schools can do that don't involve punishment and depriving someone of an education.